So, as the professor very rightly said, that a lot of machine learning and AI problems are very well suited for applications in India because of two things. One, sir, as you correctly mentioned, the scale. The second, there is a break-in process. So we actually borrow a lot of natural language techniques. For example, when Urban Ladder, a Kalaari company, right? When you're buying furniture from Urban Ladder, in India, you don't put 7th Cross, 175th Avenue. You know, you have your address and then you say opposite HDFC Bank ATM behind Hanuman Mandir, right? And now, can you understand the human intent from that sentence in the address and convert that, right? In US, when a driver goes, he says that the lunch break is between 1 to 2 p.m. So solving something like a traveling salesman problem, it becomes like a hobby project, right? But in India, it's going to be a 45-minute break anywhere between 12:30 to 3 o'clock. Can you slot that? So yeah, because, you know, as a country, we glorify Jugaad. There is a lot of, whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, I'm not going to get into that. But yeah, it's not really a rule-based society. It's a lot of, relies on human expertise. And that's why modeling that is where, is precisely the difference between machine learning and the erstwhile rule-based systems.
Yeah. Well said, Nishith. Very quickly, myself, Umakant Soni. Myself, Umakant Soni. I'm a founding partner of venture firm called Pi Ventures. And we are a dedicated fund for AI. It was unheard of, 6-7 years back. When I started a chatbot company in 2009-10, and thinking that it's a great time to start because I read an interesting article by Ray Kurzweil talking about some of AI is going to be more than human intelligence by 2029. So I started this chatbot company, and we thought that we are solving the next big problem, and we realized that none of the investors in India bought that idea, and fortunately Kalaari started after 3-4 years, but it was very hard. We built a pretty good technology, but it was very hard to convince investors that we could actually grow a company like that out of India. So that is also a primarily reason why we started this fund, saying that if this is an area, this is a technology which is going to reshape pretty much every single vertical, then as well as start a dedicated fund around it so that we can grow not only a community of entrepreneurs which will be leveraging that, but also grow the whole ecosystem. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome all of you to this session at SMC 6, Startup Masterclass 6. It's the 6th in the series, and first 5 have been targeted as inspiring. This is the first one where we are saying arising, and the idea is that inspiring, arise, and actionize, and basically move a lot of IIT alumni towards nation building by leveraging that, the alumni network that we have. So welcome, a warm welcome to all of you. Please give a big round of applause to them. And we chose this topic for the panel because we thought it's very, very pertinent. And given that TK is sitting right here and he has got the historical context, when, in late, or shall I say, last part of the previous century, we started to connect up and through internet and email, different kind of people across the globe, and you could actually sell knowledge of one person to another person, and the whole knowledge economy got born. And while India did not have the resources to invest in the horizontal innovation that came up, and you had companies like, Sycamore Networks and a whole bunch of these companies which actually laid the foundation of networks which came out in Silicon Valley. We had giants like Infosys and Wipro come out of that because they leveraged this disruption much better than any other company did. And while the other companies caught up later on, I feel AI could be in a similar space where a lot of fundamental AI research is available in form of frameworks, whether you say TensorFlow, whether you say Watson, whether you say Destiny, whether you say Azure Machine Learning. But we have the creative talent right out here which could actually leverage that and build vertical applications. And I'm emboldened by the fact that we are realizing, and we are talking to, we've talked to almost close to 250 companies, some of them claiming to be AI companies, some of them sticking AI around their businesses, or some of them actually generally leveraging AI. But one thing we found very common, that there are three major elements sticking out. One, data is very cheap in India as compared to rest of the globe. So it's easy to buy data to basically build your engine initially. Second, AI talent is available in India because a lot of bigger companies, including IBM, including Google, Amazon, they are actually training their talent in AI. And it's available now because the opportunity cost in India is a lot less. If you are in Valley, you get paid $1 million, and then you don't want to come out and start a startup, which future of which is probably quite unknown. The third point is the ability for businesses to buy from these startups when they come out with a disruptive technology. So while 5-6 years back, when we were trying to do chatbot, we went to everyone. We went to Airtel, we went to Vodafone. None of them bought it, despite a very clear economic distinction. But now, businesses are buying it. So I think that lays us with a hypothesis which is interesting, that can we leverage AI in such a way that we can leapfrog the globe? Currently, India has the third largest AI startup cluster. And it's ahead of China and Israel. And when we talk about it, it's kind of like shock to a lot of people, including in India. So can we take up that as a starting position, and can we leverage AI that is available to leapfrog? And with that thought, we thought that it would be an interesting session, and given this kind of panel that we have, to examine this from multiple perspectives. So one quick question I would like to start from the panel is that, what do you think has changed in last 3 to 4 years? And I would start with TK.
I'll take a shot at that. So, we are in a very unique spot here in India. Simply because if you look at all our processes and everything that we do, number one, the variation that we contend with in our daily life is kind of massive. It's very different from what you have in a developed country. You try coming from the center of the city to Whitefield, and you realize it can take you anything from 30 minutes to something like 50 minutes on a good day.
That's true.
So that's, anything that you do, the variation is enormous. And the funny thing is that the data sets that lead to the variation also kind of are significantly different from situation to situation. And the third, which I think is extremely important in a country like India, is that whatever problem you pick, you have enormous scale. With these three things out here available in an environment like ours, I think it provides a wonderful test bed, not to go back and recreate fundamental technology, but to go out there and see what you can do in kind of applying the technologies already available to solving real life problems. And the fundamental information asymmetry that remains, that makes the market imperfect, now kind of goes away. And I think that's one of the biggest strengths that we have in India. So my own sense is that in India, we'll always continue to have an ecosystem that's going to be large, that's going to be varied, that can be applied, problem solutions from which can be applied across the world. And I think that's really the opportunity that we're sitting on today. If we believe that we can go out there and fundamentally do things on the technology side, personally, if I had to put $1 between solving real life problems and doing basic research around this, my bet would be on the first, because that's where the real opportunity sits. Any area that you pick up healthcare, pick up logistics, pick up hotels, pick up anything. Each area you can apply AI to solve a bunch of problems, because number one, like Umakant said, data sets are available, and stitching together the whole thing to get a solution is really unique in a country like ours.
Yeah, and very quickly, would like to ask Dr. Partha as well, from a technology perspective, what do you foresee has changed in last 3 to 4 years? We hear a lot about deep learning. How is that fundamentally impacted, or do you think that is playing a large part?
So I think things have definitely kind of changed over the last few years. And in particular, I guess kind of like convergence of three things have made some of these changes possible. So one is development in infrastructure, like large-scale distributed computing, cloud computing, like availability of computing. Second is availability of data in many domains. So I'm just talking globally, not just in Indian context. Availability of data. And then the third thing is advances in statistical learning algorithms, machine learning, AI techniques. So I'll come back to that shortly. But if you think about it, in human history, none of these three things came together at one point of time, right? So this is that way kind of like a very unique juncture, and it's good to see that progress is happening in that direction. So in terms of advances in statistical learning techniques, machine learning, so we hear a lot about deep learning, probably every day in newspaper you have multiple reports on that. But the interesting thing is many of those techniques are not new, right? There is definitely some amount of advances, but many of the core technologies for those were developed 20, 30 years back. But what was interesting is those algorithms were ahead of their time in some sense. They were too powerful algorithms which were not supported by the limited amount of data that was available at that point of time, right? So that way this convergence has kind of made many of these advances possible. And I think that's undeniable, right? So if you look at many important problems like speech recognition, in computer vision, there's dramatic improvements, which is undeniable, and probably this is just the beginning. Thanks.
Yep.
So I was thinking about the answer in exactly the same way. It's a convergence. What I'd throw in into that mix is a couple of things. Because of all these factors, because of the data development in deep learning abilities, etc., things are finally beginning to work at an acceptable level, right? You've always had speech recognition algorithms for 30, 40 years, but today your error rate is less than 6%, 5%, and that is when a consumer, an enterprise consumer and end consumer will start using it. Obviously, there's data to say that if you come to one of these, it doesn't work satisfactorily for you once or twice, you go away forever, right? But that's changed, right? And two, of course, we could throw in the angle that today, more than ever before, resources, research, work, VC money, teams are actually chasing real-life problems to solve. I think it's the convergence of all of these coming together that, you could say finally it's beginning to happen.
Yeah, and I would ask actually Nishith to throw it from the perspective of business models, or what's the customer reaction is when you go and sell these solutions to them, or how do you do that?
So to be honest, the best customer reaction is no reaction, right? The end customer should never know how the magic happened, whether behind haptic there was a human sitting or a chatbot sitting, right? And actually, I have a slightly more boring answer to this, that I would actually say, exactly as he mentioned, that nothing has really changed, right? Very specifically speaking, one thing that has changed is that now we have a lot more of compute, the scale of the compute. Also, one thing that has changed is the type of compute. So now graphics card, as in CUDA or parallel computes, have become a very mainstay, and that has been the primary lever in changing the literature. So today, all of you have ordered something at your home, broadly, where an AI algorithm decided which driver will pick which car and come to you at what time. And that's the beauty, that they should never know, right? Second thing, why, as he precisely mentioned, it has just now we read a lot of literature, and still a lot of techniques we apply are broadly 100 years old, right? Like how ants move on Earth, right? It's just that the amount of data and the scale of compute that is available makes it perform at a level that is acceptable in production, right? Because in production, even a 99% thing leaves you at 1%, which in absolute number becomes a few thousand, right? So that's why. So I think what has really changed is today, AI algorithms perform at a level that you don't know it's an algorithm, right? When your loan gets approved, it's rarely a human that is approving it.
Although I don't know whether it still happens in India or not,
We're
because
doing
it never gets approved.
Let me
Sure.
what the rest of the panel has said. So I think, you know, what I think fundamentally has changed in AI is actually now there's a business case, right? You cannot imagine, you know, some of the business cases we encounter on a daily basis, right? And it has happened because of more availability of compute, storage, and all of that, yes, right? That's on the cost side. But if you see on the benefit side, right, I think a lot of people do not realize that AI, and especially, Mr. Kurien said this in the context of enterprises, right? The business case is really something that did not exist before. And just let's take an example from a very mundane industry, let's say call centers, right? I don't know how many of you guys know, and we've done these studies in Indian call centers, right? In a typical telco call center, right, the average retention time for an agent that talks to you is about 10 months, right? The whole organization churns every 10 months. It is 100% attrition, right, if you will. And you know, among the time that they stay, right, I think close to about 60 to 70% of that time is spent training and under supervision of a subject matter expert, right? So you taught this guy, 60%, 70% of the time was just teaching, preparing them. They're not really interested in that job and don't see that as a long-term profession, and then they leave. So think of two types of impact, right? What impact it's making to the quality of service delivered to your customers. Chances are that these guys haven't, you know, really been there long enough to know how to troubleshoot your roaming issue or whatever it is, right? Secondly, you just invested this tons of money in training, right? And you're constantly hiring, rehiring. Same pattern happens in RMs in the financial industry, right? So just collectively think of all the institutional knowledge loss and the associated monetary impact that happens, right? So AI, right, is not, I mean, you know, getting more clicks to an ad or, you know, vision recognition, these are great use cases as well. But, you know, the deeper use cases in business for AI are actually sitting in all these places. And, you know, I mentioned the Manipal examples. You will see that impact in India, right, where you just don't have enough doctors trained to be oncologists, right? So these are the places who have huge, you know, millions and billions of dollars in business cases. That has changed, right? So the cost going down, of course, helps, right? But no industry, AI or no technology rather, AI or any other, right, really gets into prime time till these business cases show up. So I actually think that's what has fundamentally changed, and more so in India than in any other place.
Yeah. In fact, I would like to take you up on that, and you know, coming back to the point that TK was making earlier, is the fact that maybe when you are coming out of Silicon Valley or you're sitting in Silicon Valley, you're probably innovating for the first billion, right? Versus when you're sitting in India and trying to look at problems around you, you could potentially be innovating for the next 6 billion, because what exists in India is very similar to Southeast Asia, very similar to Middle East, Africa, and whole bunch of these other markets, which are, you know, very similar in terms of the problem. And just coming back to the perspective that, you know, Uber founder made, that probably India would be the last place to see an autonomous car, you know, existing. But maybe India would see a different kind of business model, or even the kind of research that would get applied here could be different. So I'm just trying to pick TK's thoughts further on that.
You know, I'll give you an example of going back to the business case, you know, going back to the enterprise space, on a real life example that we have worked on. You know, banks across the world, how many of you are from the banking industry? I'd be surprised if there's one or two. There are a few hands up, okay? Anyway, so I won't kind of spend too much of time on the dark side, but I'll kind of give you an example of what happened, which is around what is called as anti-money laundering. So, you know, many years ago, about 3 years ago, one of my customers came to me and said, so I was talking to him. This guy was the chief operating officer of one of the top 3 banks in the world. And I was asking him, so tell me, where is your cost equation kind of changing? Because he was busy laying off people like crazy. And surprisingly, the absolute cost-income ratio wasn't changing. So he gave me this whole spiel about how his compliance cost is going up. And he gave me a projection telling me that that particular year, his cost is going to be close to about $1 billion. 2 years later, he estimated his cost to be $5 billion, around just one area called anti-money laundering. So what is anti-money laundering? It's pretty simple, actually. Every time a person or a transaction comes into your network, you got to make sure that the money that's actually being passed up, handed over, or passing through your network isn't coming from a source that is tainted. That's an as simple means that's what it really means. So if you go back and look at it, you have to go back and look at the source to see if the source is tainted. You have to go back and look at the recipient to see if this recipient by any form is tainted. So their error rates when they used to pass this used to be the first transaction that used to pass, their algorithm is to clear close to about 98%. This particular bank used to clear 4 million transactions in a day. So you can assume that 2% of that is a big one. Whatever was the residual used to go to Florida to a bunch of analysts who used to go through it, trawl through the data, and they used to kind of assimilate the data, and if they felt there was an issue, they used to take roughly 3 hours to do it. They used to pass about 50% of them. The balance 50% used to go to lawyers. And those lawyers used to spend roughly about 9 hours. The funny thing was that the way these guys were running the engine, there was very little annotation of data to go back to source and say person A was tainted or not tainted. The next time around when person A came, a not tainted result was obtained. Instead of that, it went through the same kind of loop. It's a very simple example. At the end of 3 years now, what we have found is that we are able to pass close to about 99.7% transactions through the engine correctly. 0.3% still remains. But the biggest issue that we had was not proving the technology. That was easy because there was a real life problem for that. The real issue was going and explaining to the regulator on how it was done. Because the regulators just couldn't believe that a machine could do it. So in spite of the fact that we were able to solve a real life problem, it took us another year to get the regulators on board, and after the regulators got on board, it's been magic. So this is an example of how you can scale, and we used India really for that. Because the funny thing about India is that, while you do the same AML transactions, the data sets that you get in India to refine the algorithm is huge. So we tested it here in India, we were able to refine the algorithm in India, and then we were able to apply it globally. So just an example of how you can use India as a test base for a lot of these activities, which you can scale globally later.
Yeah, and
just to add one line there. So, sir, interestingly, I wrote some of the AML algorithms for Amazon, and over there, their problem was actually their problem wasn't accuracy. Their humans were doing it, but the creed of the project was, can you do it in sync time? Like before your transaction finishes, can you detect the AML right there? So that's another key advantage of pardon my French, but it takes 9 months to have a human. It takes 9 seconds to boot a server, right? So if you can replace even a small piece of human decision with an algorithm, you can just scale it out, right? Like you can do it. You can do things in sync time, which used to become post-factum abuse prevention things.
Yeah.
So.
And I think that's a very important point, because what happens is humans act in a linear fashion. And once you put an algorithm in, an algorithm is exponential. So suddenly what happens is the whole equation changes completely. And that's something that a lot of us don't seem to realize. So while you have a huge bunch of people pushing employment on one end, employment also leads to information asymmetry, and the whole scaling factor just doesn't happen.
Yeah, and just to quickly take it up further, because definitely the data is there. Before we throw up the panel to the audience questions, a couple of quick questions. One is that I would love to see, because you pointed out business case, you pointed out business value, the ease of consumer experience is another one. What are the factors, you get to name only one, that you think would probably have the potential to be the path bearer for rest of the sectors in terms of early adoption of AI? We could go from, you can start with Nishith.
Sure. I think one of the factors that will strongly impact adoption of AI is how metricized the industry is, how many sensors are there. So as an investor, I would just follow where IoT is becoming big. 4 years down, ML will become big there. So if you look at it, one of the there's like AI and ML outside glorified terms is not magic, it's data processing, right? It's just better techniques of data processing. So one of the first industries that you see, where humans got replaced was stock markets in technical trading, because everything over there is down to a number and a trend line, right? The moment, for example, in logistics, right? The moment the same thing started happening to roads, that every road, every address got mapped back to a number, automation algorithms started becoming industrial applications, right? So yeah, I would say that the biggest driver for applying machine learning and AI to any business use case would be data. And if you want to
Imagination.
really see a very real
It's
world
add up
example
3 distinct Wipro can get thought factory. So
Uber, an ops company, has scaled in India without a single call center.
Yeah.
That's because when you send them an email, you get a response. Over 82 or something % of the response is not sent by a human.
imagination.
Once your text
It's
processing
changed
became
the way
smart
we
enough,
travel,
they could
the
actually
way we
operate an
communicate,
entire cab company
the
in
way
India
we
without a
live.
phone number.
Without the imagination of the ambitious.
Sumit?
So I'll point out one, which is, you said which is the one that could create maximum velocity for adoption of AI. I think for young companies, big companies, doesn't matter, to come and hit upon use cases which can be applied very quickly in India can probably drive the biggest adoption. I think the level of technology to solve those use cases is already there. It's about somebody finding the product market fit. I'll give a couple of examples. I met a company recently that says I can, pull out data from all courts. I can take a lawyer's case and I can actually help him create a network of all the things related to his case in terms of past judgments, precedents, dates, what are the laws that go into it. I can create that very simply for him and make it simple for him to process his case. If you extend that a little bit, you could apply that to the millions of cases that are sitting in each and every court in the country unsolved purely because there are not enough man hours to process those cases. Can a company help a judge or a jury to be able to come up with 95% of the work done on all the cases and enable a judge to do 30 cases instead of 3 that they're doing today, right? Is a use case that can be quickly cracked. Who pays for it? I don't know, right? For example, the government has put up call centers for farmers to call and, ask their queries on everything from seeds to timing to fertilizers to weather, whatever, right? There is data to suggest that about 45% of all these calls are basically one thing. The farmer calls and asks, when is it going to rain, right? Unfortunately, there aren't enough people manning those phones for the farmer to get that answer. Now, there's got to be a program that's got to sit there and say, if I hear when it's going to rain, got to give the answer, right? And that can fundamentally change how much help a farmer gets from this. Again, I don't know who pays for that, right? But there are so many use cases in India which are kind of in the roti, kapda, makan genre. We can get to efficiencies of Uber, but there are so many problems that can be fundamentally changed with the help of AI. I think cracking those use cases.
Okay. Dr. Partha?
So I guess kind of like in terms of adoption, once kind of like the initial low-hanging fruits are picked. So one of the technical challenges that I see is the need for explainability, right? So right now, like if your doctor is, if you're replacing your doctor with an AI agent, and it's giving you a judgment, okay, you have diagnosed with this particular disease, but you'd like to know why that particular decision was made, right? So right now, I think that's a big gap in technology itself, all over. So we need the kind of advances in explainability of the technology itself before we can kind of push it to the next level.
Okay. Dr. Prashant?
So, I think the adoption will cut across multiple industries, but the common theme is going to be scaling expertise or, scaling knowledge or codifying knowledge, right? So that's one common concept enabled by AI, right? Which has huge, huge implications and hugely disruptive and also, constructive in that sense, right? They are good for those industries. Prashant was just mentioning about this law thing. There's a startup in New York called Ross Intelligence who already built a cognitive lawyer, and that lawyer has been hired by a New York law firm to do their legal research, right? KPMG is one of our large clients who are applying this to, all sorts of functions that basically they do. I think you need to see, there's something quietly happening right around us, which I think a lot of us don't pick up. So I'll take an example from my personal life. And my daughter is 8 years old, right? For her high school science project, she programmed a drone, right, to actually go and, save people in a fire or something like that. So, what's happening is that, the focus when these kind of waves happen, right, tends to be a lot on the technology, right? And, I come from IBM research. I have that affinity too. But, the exponential scale happens when that is democratized, right? You no longer have to have a PhD to actually, go leverage AI, right? And that's the whole, the API game, right? So what we've tried, so the reason my daughter was able to program a drone very easily is that the abstractions for flying a drone have been, raised to a higher level. She doesn't have to hack into the hardware. So, if you think of AI, right, democratization of AI, right, is something we are driving, right, as a technology company. And then its use in terms of disruption, I mean, the maximum impact you're going to see in the knowledge industry. And that's, my bet is it's less than a year away. It's not futuristic, it's just a matter of less than a year where you'll actually see a whole bunch of disruption in the knowledge industry built on AI. So that's the space to look out for, in my view.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'll take a slightly different approach to give you a different answer to this. If you look at the cost of doing business in India versus the cost of doing business in China, the estimate would be that anywhere between 8 to 14% is the differential. India is higher. In spite of the fact that our labor costs are much lower, they're about 50%, 40 to 50% lower. There are some estimates which even say 60%, but I'll leave that aside for a minute. If you look at the gap, this 14% gap, if you take the upper end, roughly about 6 to 7% comes from information asymmetry, which means that you apply for permission, you don't know where your file has disappeared.
Simply
That's
download access.
There'll be some guy sitting there who will kind of demand his pound of flesh for making sure the file goes through. That's again an example of information asymmetry. The balance is infrastructure, logistics, and a whole bunch of things. That is the opportunity that we can kind of go after. That 6 to 8% that sits there, that's the kind of big difference between making the country competitive and keeping the country uncompetitive. And for that, the biggest change really has to happen in the way governments react to people. Agriculture is an excellent example of that. Healthcare is an example of that. There are examples across the board. Today, the government machinery is incapable of buying from small players. If you're a small player and you go to the government and say, here is my wonderful product, do you want to buy it? The first thing would be, are you qualified? Are you a qualified seller? Do you have 5 years track record in terms of a balance sheet? And that's impossible for a small company to ever react to and get into that game. So I think, given the fact that right now we have a government that's at least digitally savvy, this is one area where we can substantially move the meter, if you may, to make changes, to make sure that the government itself is able to buy. There is going to be resistance from a whole bunch of people because information asymmetry creates a parallel economy of its own. And you will have significant resistance coming from that particular segment. But that's the area of opportunity. There are millions of problems today that we can solve here using AI. And it'll be a waste and a huge loss for us if we don't do it.
Yep, very pertinent remarks. Very quickly, we have got time for only 5 questions. So we'll start at the back. Yeah, the gentleman seems to be the farthest.
Hi, my name is Vivek. So, as computers get better than humans at doing most tasks, is unemployment going to be a big problem for the future?
Would like to take that?
Because we've already heard statements like humans are linear, as though, we are talking about some other species. And we have also heard some statements about replacing humans, right? Is this going to be a problem that we have to worry about, or we don't have to be, because we are probably on the other side of the line, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
So here's what it is. I don't think, as far as the human is concerned, the beauty of the human being has been our fundamental nature is one of we've learned over the years. And I don't know how many of you read this book called Sapiens. And if you haven't, I would strongly suggest you go and read it. So it's pretty simple. 3 million years ago, there was a chimpanzee somewhere in Africa. The chimpanzee had 2 kids, two female kids. And one female turned out to be our ancestor, the other remained a chimpanzee. And why? It was just that particular branch of the chimpanzee learned faster, and it was able to evolve in societies where the might of the society made impact. And I think as far as the human being is concerned, if the human being does not learn, if the human being doesn't adapt, that particular branch of the human being is pretty much kind of gone. So I think it doesn't matter whether you're 6 or 60, you better learn to kind of learn it, better have the gumption to learn every day. I think that's extremely important. So I don't think a human being will ever be knocked out, because the set of problems that we have are always going to require connectivity between what a machine does and the variation that you see in the real world. So there is always going to be a need for a human being, but the human being has got to learn how to integrate rather than remain narrow in a particular field. I think that's the value.
Right, and if I may, we having had experience in, doing these projects across different industry verticals for several years, right? We do have a point of view on this, right? And I think, a lot of this concern, right, is not really well founded. So I think, just like the Industrial Revolution, right? I mean, some workers were replaced by machines, right? If you see, so let's take specific examples, right? I mean, Manipal, we are not replacing doctors, absolutely not, right? Watson sits as an assistant to that doctor. And because the doctor cannot ingest or necessarily recall 15 million pages of cancer literature and the 44,000 clinical trials that are published every year, right? This guy is here to assist the doctor in making, right, the right diagnosis for the patient. Maybe he's ignoring something that was published in a paper and may have an adverse reaction for a particular patient. So he's helping, right? Now take a lower end thing, right? Let us say that call center thing. See, the issue there is, why are those people leaving every 10 months, right? They probably don't see that as their long-term job anyway. Maybe they went on to do more creative things or something else, which was better use of their time. Sitting there with a phone all day, right, responding to calls was maybe not the best use of human capability in there, right? So, I think and in fact, we are making efforts so together with, Google, Amazon, Microsoft, IBM, we've actually created a, consortium globally where actually a lot of these concerns and issues and policy decisions, right, around AI are actually being, sort of debated, and we are informing that decision. But I can assure you, this is, in terms of, machines enslaving humans and all of that, that is more of, sort of in popular literature, you will see those kind of things. Another example I was giving in my talk earlier was, look at primary education in India, right? I mean, do you think we are going to solve that problem by throwing, more people at the problem? No. The student to teacher ratios are not going to improve anytime soon. The quality of that education, everything we are banking on for India, right, to become in the next couple of years is dependent on what is the quality of primary education we are doing today. This kind of scale issues, right, which test the limits of human capacity, human cognition. These are the areas that AI needs to be there, right, for us to have, long-term benefit and more equal society, right? I mean, that's our point of view.
So as a quick summary, you should be on the right branch. Nishith, very quickly, you wanted to say something?
One of the advantages of being young is I can be politically incorrect. So to be honest, Professor, I think that assistant will replace that oncologist at some point or the other outside the public policy, right? But the thing is, why are there so many oncologists diagnosing cancer? They could all be researching on eliminating or solving cancer. So like your concern, like I've answered it a couple of times, although albeit it was, asked a lot more politely, but it's valid and it will happen, and it's the same concern people have for last 100 years the moment electricity came into the thing, right? People will just elevate to doing better things. So instead of diagnosing cancer, they will be solving cancer for life, right? That's what I believe.
Okay. Very quickly, last question.
So, hi, my name is Gaurav, and first of all, it's a very eminent panel, and I learned a lot today. It's a great discussion and lovely points. So AI for me, I'm a basic guy, so I know that there's machine learning, there's computer vision, and there is NLP. And when it comes to India, English is not our primary language, and NLP is a very big part of how AI is going to touch common lives. So I want to ask, in India, what are we doing about NLP taking regional languages, especially Hindi, because that's a very primary language?
So good question. It's just very, very contextual for me because I've been working on this area, meeting a few startups. There are, and without naming any companies here, there are companies that are actually going beyond what Nuance is able to do today, what Google is able to do today. They are basing their thesis on a lot of the work that needs to happen in India needs to happen on Indian data. Now you cannot go and take Doordarshan Hindi and try to create a speech recognition platform because that's not how we speak, right? So this particular company that I've been looking at, talking to, has created NLP that understands English, right? And eventually they'll get to whatever combination of Kannada and English and so on, right? So there is a lot of fundamental work happening in India also, and exactly to the point that 70% of India speaks vernacular, non-English, right? So there is work happening there, and I think they are obviously cognizant of the same problem that you're pointing out.
Yeah, fairly good. Dr. Partha, would you like to say anything?
Sure, yeah. So yeah, I guess kind of like among Indian languages also there are like gradations of different languages. So for Hindi, right, it's like an economically very interesting language because there's so many people speaking it, right? And so there maybe like more global pairs might be interested in investing technologies there, right? For example, Google Machine Translation also has like a hit translation to Hindi, right? But then we have like lots of like 200 major languages, right? So I guess like if we don't solve those problems, people from outside are not going to kind of like address those, right? So there are kind of like works, so definitely from the government side, there are support to kind of like, develop resources and things like that for all these other main languages at least. But there's a long way to go. And in many of those things also, I think like we'll have to rethink about doing like, developing newer techniques because just like you take off-the-shelf things that have worked for English, right? That's not going to directly translate to like, some other language where like the data isn't as much available, right? So, so things are happening, but there's a long way to go.
Yeah. Quickly, one last quick question. You only have one sentence to reply with. In case we are not able to leapfrog, I mean, why we would not be able to leapfrog? What's the risk factor, right? Leveraging AI, why would not be able to leapfrog as a nation? One quick sentence. Yep. What is the biggest risk that you see?
I'm an optimist. And I really believe that there's nothing that's going to prevent us from kind of leapfrogging if we put our minds to it. We as a culture are a jugaad culture, to use a term that's common here. And we have learned from the day we are born that we have to kind of, if there's a little hole somewhere, we drive a truck through it. So I think there's enormous opportunity for us. So I wouldn't think there's any constraint today.
Okay, no constraints.
Yeah, I agree. So, this is a market-driven thing. There's absolutely no way. There's no way that we won't leapfrog, right? I mean, there's enough and more. There's enough talent. There's enough data. All the requirements for making letting India leapfrog. We leapfrogged in telecom. We leapfrog in digital banking. It's going to happen. No, I don't see any roadblocks.
Yeah, we are leapfrogging anyway into digital payments as well.
So I'm optimistic overall as well. But the question is like how much potential we have, whether we are going to hit that or not. I'm particularly worried about the human capital. Like, we talk about the demographic divide. Like at the top of the cream, probably like, there are well-trained people. But there is like in my view, like, if you leave aside like the top ranking school, like, engineering education in the rest of the country is a bit dim situation, to put it mildly, right? So I think there is how we can kind of like exploit that and like train people on a large scale so that like they can contribute to this new economy. I think that's a little bit of a challenge, but I have no doubt that like
we will leapfrog. Okay, very encouraging.
I'm a VC, I have to be an optimist. But if I have to think of a concern, I'd actually completely concur with Professor Partha. I think human capital and talent is probably the only, slowing factor. It won't stop it completely, but it could slow it down.
Okay. Nishith?
If there's a concern, I would say public policy. I mean, look at biotech. If we were okay with the risk of creating a Hulk, I'm sure we would have cured cancer.
Fantastic. Thanks a lot. It was pleasure having you join in as a conversation. I would like to thank all of the panelists here. Thanks a lot for taking out time and sharing your expertise with us. Thanks a lot. We have a small memento of gift that I would like Sujit ji to hand over. So this is a storybook of IIT Kanpur. So thank you guys, and I would like to welcome the next panel.